My name is Winfred Wenzel Wea Sr., and yes, I am Brian's dad. I would like to begin by saying I was born in a small West African nation called Liberia. And the history of Liberia is centered around free slaves from the United States of America that went back and settled and started a republic. Liberia had always been looked upon as a peaceful nation and opened her doors to a lot of refugees during her time. There were refugees from other countries in Africa that came to Liberia, and so Liberia was considered a very peaceful nation until 1979. In 1979 were the first tastes of riots against the government, and it led to bloodshed. And it was a very shaky situation. And then came 1980 when we actually had a military coup d'etat, and this was the toppling of a government, and the military took over. That was also a very traumatic period in the life of the nation. And then all of this culminated in the Civil War that broke out in December of 1989. And it was a very, very brutal conflict. At the end of the day, more than 250,000 people lost their lives. And there was like more than 1 million people, Liberian citizens, that were scattered all over the continent, and others fled the continent and went on to Europe and other parts of the world. Personally, it was an experience that has left an indelible mark on my own conscience. It's something that I can never forget because these were really, really traumatic situations. A lot of us at the time never thought that the nation would degenerate in such chaos and such violence. And it took a toll on the national psyche. One of the things that impacted the nation was that a whole swath of the generation, because of the destruction, because of the mayhem, a whole swath of the generation did not go to school. It degenerated to a point where there were child soldiers that were involved. They were conscripted at a very young age, and they participated in this war that took so many lives. I remember that we were internally displaced because of the proximity of the fight, and we had to move out of the areas that were being bombed. And I remember me and one of my uncles and just a group of family members that were journeying together. Some of the things that we saw just can never be undone. The literal smells of what we experienced to our senses was something that we will never forget. And just not trying to risk the gruesomeness, but just trying to be forthright with what we experienced. We experienced looking at corpses decaying in the sun. We saw things that to this day continues to linger in our minds. And at the time, you really don't think that you're traumatized. Maybe it's because of the adrenaline. Maybe it's because you're in the heat of the moment. But those things they never go away. We had the unfortunate experience of looking at mass graves. We had the unfortunate experience of seeing people killed randomly and for very little reason. And so it really stuck with us. Finally, one of the things that made me to really realize how traumatizing these experiences were for me was when I made it out of Liberia and came to the States in 1998. I remember being picked up by my friend, and we were driving to her home. And it just happens that, and this was somewhere in Albany, New York. And as we were coming down the highway Pike and coming down towards the street, I will never forget this. They had a carnival going on at the bottom, and this was the last day of the carnival. And usually, the last day of the carnival, there were fireworks that would be on display. And I remember that as we drove down off the interstate, the fireworks begun, and they were very loud. And I remember just subconsciously ducking in the car. I was taking cover because for a split second, I began reliving what we had experienced in the Civil War in Liberia. The sounds of the firework was, to me at that moment, the sounds of rockets and bombs. And I just, without thinking, I started to duck. And my friend began to laugh. And she said to me, "Oh no, it's just fireworks." And I started to laugh at myself. But it was a reminder to me that the trauma that I underwent through the Civil War in Liberia stays with me. Now, I'd like to conclude with what has been happening in recent times in our nation. You know, it only takes a step before things goes into chaos. And one of the things that has continued to hit me in recent times is just the amount of division that we have in this nation at this time, and where people are not looking at each other as, just opponents, but people now begin to look at each other as enemies, and those are the tiny steps that lead to chaos in a society. And it just doesn't happen overnight, but it is an accumulation. If these ills in our societies are not addressed, and if we as a people are not prepared to take it on and say, hey, we are not enemies. We may have different views. We may have different opinions, and that's all right. But at the end of the day, we are all Americans. And my fear and my prayer is for this nation that we will not regress to that point, but that somehow cooler heads will prevail, and we will come to a point of realization that, hey, we are all one people. We may have, again, different policies, positions. That's all right. But we can come to the table of brotherhood, and we can discuss, we can argue, we can even agree to disagree. But we must always remember that we are Americans, and it does not take a whole lot to tear down what has been built over centuries by our founding fathers. So that's a part of the trauma that I feel in recent times, because that's just what happened in Liberia that ultimately led to a civil war that killed so many people and displaced a whole lot of people. And I do not want to see that happen here in the United States of America. So this is something that I live with. I know I can't erase it because it's a part of my experience. But what I can learn from it is, hey, we don't have to go down that path. We don't have to, because it only leads to destruction, and it's a negative, not a positive, on society as a whole. Again, I'm Winfred. We are senior. I am Brian's dad, and I'm happy that I could share a part of my experience and the traumas that I deal with to this day.